Hi, I'm Nate Dalager with HDR Engineering. I'm a water resource engineer up in Thief River Falls, and I have 29 years of experience helping develop, plan, design, and permit water resource projects, specifically impoundments. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Red River Watershed Management Board, the Flood Damage Reduction Work Group, and the International Water Institute for providing some of the content of my presentation. Retention is one of the approaches to addressing flooding in Minnesota and the Red River Basin. Typically, retention is built where the land can be modified with earthen embankments, or otherwise the topography is developed to hold water generally closer to where it falls and can be then retained until the downstream systems are subsiding from flooding, and then you can release that water safely. Many impoundments have been built over the years, especially in the Red River Basin, but the problem is not yet solved. Retention is still a necessary component going forward of our flood damage reduction solutions.
The Red River Basin is a vital Minnesota region. Damage from flooding threatens the sustainability of the region's economic base, water quality, and natural resources.
Finding solutions to flood damage is a difficult task in the Red River Basin. We've got a large area that floods, we've got lots of water coming into our rivers and streams, and we've got flat country. We've got to find solutions to those problems by working together in a collaborative process.
Flooding is still occurring. We've come a long ways in addressing flood damage reduction in a lot of our urban centers, but as you can see, we still have urban and industrial flooding, as well as agricultural and lake flooding across the Red River Basin. And as we work towards ultimately that solution and that goal, I'm going to explain to you how retention has worked in the past and how it can still work in the future. There's still plenty of floodplains that can be wiped out by a myriad of solutions, but one of those shall likely include retention going forward. As recently as 2019, we had floods of record in many areas of northwest Minnesota. How does retention work? Well, specifically, it helps shave off hydrographs from flood peaks. So in this example right here, you can see that with a couple of different alternatives, with retention in place, you can reduce peak flows by as much as 25%, and then you can reduce the duration, which is calculated by the horizontal axis, by several days in terms of depth of flooding on the landscape. You have a situation oftentimes where there's an existing floodplain that is in this small community here, but by implementing retention upstream of that community on the flood sources, you can go from what's shown here in the lower left hand, which is that floodplain and that flooding river, and by sequestering that flood water in that site shown on the upper right, the entire city will be removed from the floodplain thanks to retention and some other project components that are featured. Retention is typically looked at from a drainage area perspective, and it's usually sited on the lower end of a subwatershed where it can capture as much water as possible. Things are done such as designing inlet works to improve upstream drainage to bring water more efficiently into the site, as well as outlet works. But with that approach, it helps us achieve our goals, which is flood damage reduction downstream. Another example where retention is helpful is in the ungated fashion, where water is not behind a gated dam, but it's maybe higher than that, and it flows in and is retained temporarily and it flows out as shown in this hydrograph versus this hydrograph where retention is actually gated. And then as you can see, many, many days later, it is released well after the flood has subsided downstream. Both ungated and gated retention is important. As we look at many solutions to flooding, like in the example of agricultural flooding, where there's repetitive damage on a very consistent basis, retention also has a function there, not just for a drainage purpose only, but to help, and combined with drainage, reduce the overall damages. In this graphic here, what is demonstrated is that in the Red River Basin, for the most part, the agricultural damages that are occurring on the very, very frequent events, the 5-year, the 10-year, that's where most of the damages are still occurring. We're not always needing to address the 100-year flood event, which is important to address for urban areas, but for agriculture, a lot of retention now is focusing on those more commonly occurring events. In addition to flood damage reduction, retention offers enhancements to benefits like recreation, wildlife habitat, helping with stream flow and altered hydrology, putting more of a natural flow regime into downstream systems, reduction in sediment and erosion, improvement in water quality, and there's even a recreational component with retention. Now that we've established this, how about how? How do we do retention and why retention? Seems like we've done a lot of retention already. Well, as we look at water management, we've got basically 4 major categories, 1 being drainage, 2 being protection, which is levees and field-side berms, community levees. There is diversion, which is another form of conveyance or just kind of moving the problem around an area, and then finally retention. Well, each one of these has their place in a particular area, whether that be the lower end of a watershed, the middle, or the upper, but retention really has the purpose and a function in any one of those areas.
Since 1998, people in the basin have worked together to build solutions under the mediation process. This process has clear goals for flood damage reduction and natural resource enhancement. After 10 years, this work is bearing fruit. A primary approach in reducing flood damage is to strategically hold water where it falls by creating impoundments.
What's the process of running off, and how do we decide which tool we use from the flood damage reduction toolbox? So you've got rainfall and snowmelt falling on the landscape. Some of it's working into the soil profile, but eventually we've got depression water, which for a lot of Minnesota is no longer naturally in existence, and then runoff, and it's that water that we're trying to manage with retention. Traditional ditch design has had something to do with the problem, but also even natural systems tend to move the water to the lower end where the flooding occurs, and that's where you have floodplains. Well, what we'd like to see as a concept, both for drainage diversion concepts, is for retention as well, store the water throughout the drainage area with distributed storage, or in this case, retention. Okay, you can see that retention can come in the form of constructed storage, on-channel dams in some cases, off-channel systems, and wetlands. But what we're going to focus on here is constructed off-channel retention. In this example, this is a satellite image of flooding that was occurring across, this is probably a 40-mile swath of landscape there up near Roseau, Minnesota. And with that flood, what we're able to do with the proposed retention site is basically wipe out 80% of that floodplain. Okay, you can see now it's going to color that back in. This is the type of flooding we still aim to reduce. Lakes continue to have problems, high water lakes. Retention is also part of the solution for really any flooding problem. Likely has a portion of its solution in a retention concept.
I'm standing on the west embankment of the Brant Impoundment, located approximately 14 miles north of Crookston, Minnesota. This project was constructed as part of a flood damage reduction effort in the valley to help alleviate flooding downstream.
The watershed approached me about 3 years ago to see if I would be interested in letting me use this piece of property for their impoundment. Downstream flooding that was going on, and we needed to try to alleviate some of that flooding, and this was one of the sites that they had picked to store some water. This spring, this whole area was underwater. We just about maxed out the capacity of the impoundment because it was about within inches maybe of going over the spillway.
This impoundment covers approximately 490 acres, and it stores approximately 3,900 acre-feet of water. You can visualize the Brant Impoundment as a large bathtub. The water fills up in this bathtub, and you ultimately come down to the outlet structure, which is what you're looking at right now, and you open the gate, just like you would the drain on your bathtub, and you drain it down slowly.
With any good project, you have to develop the goals that will address both local and regional issues, whether it's a local drainage system or like a floodplain in an urban area. And you need to find partners. You need to coordinate your infrastructure with highway departments, for example. Okay? Project in Thief River Falls was recently done with 5 different partners. You have to look at unique and creative funding solutions beyond the state of Minnesota, beyond some of the typical funding partners, such things as water management districts. There are many permits and approvals to achieve, but in the end, what you're really trying to do, as shown in this graphic, depending on which flood event you're looking at, is lower the peak downstream, and then as the hydrograph with the retention area in place is dropping, you're decreasing the duration of that flooding by many, many days and even weeks in some cases. A retention site has the potential to do great things, measurable things, especially for those frequent events that were seen, shown here, and were referenced earlier. It's a part of the Red River Basin flood damage reduction projects and the long-term flood solutions plan, but I would also draw your attention to the more frequent flooding and all the economic damages that are occurring from that. One of the ways that you can really kind of address and assess, well, how effective is a whole program of retention, a cumulative effect of retention, is this example shown from the Rosa River watershed, where they had all these different projects shown in with the little green dots, and kind of they saw the effects of what that cumulative effect was downstream. No single project solved the problem in this particular area, but the projects all linked together cumulatively had a great benefit all the way downstream to the outlet of the district. One of the more recent questions being asked of retention is, what is the cost versus the benefit? And in this chart, what you're seeing here is with the benefit line being the upper line versus costs, you want to get the maximum benefit for the lowest cost, which in this example is, here's your lowest cost, here's your maximum benefit, and then you have diminishing returns going up. Okay, well, given what the funding matrix is right now, that's kind of how the funding comes in as well. So these different interests, whether it's local, main stem, that would be the red board, or other funding mechanisms within the state and federal programs, water quality, etc., wildlife habitat, each entity needs to help pay. And what has historically helped retention occur is the red board has done this sliver, the state of Minnesota has come here, and then we've got local watersheds paying. But as that's been changing, it's becoming more and more challenging to find a funding formula that works. And you can see over time, state funding has been lagging a little bit behind, and we would just encourage our legislators and our bonding folks and the agencies to continue to push for retention as that might be in their interest as well. This is a project that's actually under construction right now, November of 2020. This is called the Black River Impoundment. You can see that that project won't be operational next spring, but it's definitely part of a program to achieve the goals of the Red River Basin in terms of flood damage reduction. So keep in mind that retention is a long-term solution for reducing flood damages for protection and enhancement of natural resources. Retention is also an important economic, environmental, and social approach to responsible flood damage reduction now, in the past, and going forward. Some of the broader goals of flood damage reduction work and retention projects are the prevention of loss of human life, prevention of damage to farm structures, homes, and communities, reduction of damage to farmland, transportation, reduction of damage to environment, generation. It's really part of the solution. As you locate your opportunity for water management, consider retention.
Moving forward is not without challenges. Some of these challenges include public acceptance, getting permits, loss of conservation lands, changing climate conditions, funding, and increased demand for draining floodwater, which moves the problem downstream to others.
We are taking a systematic and planned approach to find solutions to problems here so that we have projects that are built that not only reduce flood damages, but they enhance natural resources. And in the long run, that's going to make the Red River Basin a better place to live.
Well, that is my presentation. Did I get your retention? I thank you for this opportunity to share about retention with you. And if you have any questions, feel free to